Our speaker for today is Ayse Guveli, Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick. Her research interests include social inequalities, international migration, religion and gender. She was recently awarded the ERC Consolidator Grant for her third gen project, which explores the long-term impact of migration on the third generation of the pioneer Turkish labour migrant families and their integration patterns across different European countries. And today, Ayse will be presenting researching multi-generational consequences of migration insights from the 2000 Families project. So hand over now to get started.
Okay. I can start now, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. I am, as Sarah said, Ayse Guveli. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. Like Hill Kulu said. And noticed, I moved recently from the University of Essex to Warwick. I have worked at the University of Essex for a very long time, 18 years. Yeah, so today I would like to in the end, I would touch on what Sarah referred to, the project I have been now working on. But now I will focus on my previous research, which was a large-scale research project, and I received grant for that in 2009 and collected data. And the results of that large-scale data are now coming out or have been coming out, and there is a lot other possibilities with the data. I will touch on that later on. So the topic I titled as Multigenerational Consequences of Migration, and that will be an insight from the 2000 Families project. Before starting with my presentation, I would like to give you a little background of myself. The other day, a plumber came to fix my boiler, and he asked me, like, from your accent, I think you are not from this country. Where are you from? And then I gave him 4 chances to guess where I was from, or I am from. And he said, Spain, Italy, Greece, none of them. And then Romania, Poland. Well, no, it wasn't. So I was born in Turkey, and my parents moved to the Netherlands when I was 7. And yeah, I had my education there in the Netherlands, and then I moved myself to the UK in Essex to work there. So this is a little background to my research as well. So what am I going to, yeah, it works now, tell you about? I'll give you a little background to the 2000 Families research. Before doing that, I'll like to give you a little information about why Turkish migration and migrant groups in Europe are so interesting to study. Then the overall research question of the project will be presented. Then I will present you some findings, and there are a lot of findings. But I'll focus on a few of them, and a little bit more in detail. I'll focus on the gendered impact of migration. I'll give you the general conclusion and then touch on little bit on my new project. So the general background to the 2000 families research is like the following. So while I was doing my PhD in the Netherlands, it was about new social classes within post-industrial societies. And then while doing that, I was interested in migration, and I thought, after my PhD, I'll like to do something on migration, and read and saw that actually almost all migration research was focusing on the destination countries. And comparing migrants and their children to the majority population or to other migrant groups, and then trying to analyze and see how they were doing with the assimilation theories. And that generated this discussion that migration research in the Western societies are methodological nationalism. They employ that method of focusing predominantly on the destination countries, which has generated a huge understanding how and to what extent migrants and their children are integrating in the destination countries. But this perspective won't give us how migration impacts on migrants and their children's lives, and what kind of consequences migration has. So I proposed a new research framework, and that is we could frame the theoretical perspective as dissimilation from origins. And here, in this perspective, we compare those who moved, the migrants and their children and their grandchildren, with those who left behind or stayed behind in the origin country. And this gives us the counterfactual within, like, we might come back to this. Counterfactual economists don't like me using this concept, but if you have questions, we can discuss about that. So this perspective also gives you the impact of migration on migrants and their children, and also reveals the benefits and the losses migrants face because of that decision. So why Turks, and I will focus, and I have focused on Turkish migration to Europe. Turkish migrant group in European countries is the largest non-European Union group, well over 5 million group members it has. And this group came to Europe by guest worker program. Western European countries after Second World War were recruiting, and Germany was the country who was recruiting from Turkey. That started Turkish migration to Europe. This group lives in at least 8 European countries in large numbers. In Germany, from the group as a whole, 60% live in Germany, and 14% live in France, 12% in the Netherlands. You see there in this graph that 2% of Turkish origin people live in Denmark. But in Denmark, Turkish migrant group is the largest migrant group. So in that sense, it might look a small group in Denmark, but they are a significant presence in Denmark. So it gives us this multi-destination country perspective. They are Muslims or from Muslim origin. This is important because migration literature, although we focus in Europe on migrant groups, and they mostly are from Muslim origin countries. But in the classic migration literature, for example, the US literature, you have this Mexican migration to US, and that is analyzed to death, very much. But in Europe, we don't have that kind of research. So this might provide that, like you take this major, biggest migrant group and then focus on that. So Turkey also has been and is still, now the relations are very not that perfect, but it has been since the beginning of the European Union, aimed to become a member, and but still can't. But there is long history of Turkish-European relations. So in the 2000 families research asked, to what extent have migrants and their descendants gained or lost from migration? How has migration changed their behavior, values, and relationships? So you have change, and you have also gains or losses. So in that we say labor market outcomes would be gains. But for example, in the change in values, we wouldn't identify as gain or loss. So this is the design of the project, which focuses on 5 migrant sending regions. This is the region I am from, Trabzon, but we focused on one part of it, Akçaabat, Şarkışla, Kulu, Şarkışla, Emirdağ, and Acıpayam. These are in 1960 and 1974, was the official guest worker labor migration program. In that period, European countries and firms, companies, were going to mostly these regions, starting an office, and were recruiting migrants from these regions and brought them to destination countries, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Denmark, Sweden, and they were working there. This program was temporary. Like in 1974, this program ended. Those who came, some, I will tell more about that later, but some stayed and some moved back. Our research went to these regions, screened those regions in 2010, and asked on the doorstep whether the person who who had to be older than 18, has a relative who could be dead or alive, who moved from that region to Europe, and that person should be 65 or 90 years old. And if that person said, yes, oh, that's my, let's say, uncle, and then we took that uncle's family generation, lineage, and interviewed his family members. I'll come back to that. And then if we had 4 migrant families, we asked the same question, and then that person, that relative, should not have gone to Europe. So that will then form our non-migrant comparison family. And they were going to 10 European countries, and the distribution of the first generation men was 80% who moved, 20% who stayed. And that is the guest worker here on the top. And he was at that time 65, between 65 and 90. And his children were we took information or asked information that we call proxy information about every adult family member in the lineage of that man. That man could be migrant or non-migrant. And then we sampled 2 of his children randomly, and then 2 of their children, if there was any, and interviewed them in detail. This is our data set. In our data set, there are 1,992 first-generation men, and of those, 1,580 were migrant men, and 412 were men who stayed there. That men between 65 and 90 years old. In total, there is about 40,000 family members in the data set. We have like their age, their gender, and where they were living. And now about the proxy data, remember, we have information about all adult family members of those men, first generation men, about 20,000 of them. And then we interviewed personally 5,980 people. Okay, we can, and we published a lot. We have a book, this very blue pill, I call it, and there is a lot of chapters, and it gives you very detailed understanding about the consequences of migration of 3 generations. We have journal articles, 2 books, and plenty of semi-academic publications. So let me tell you what this table is. So here we have the generations, and this table shows you, this is the column for first generation man who stayed in Turkey. This is the first generation man who moved to Europe. And this is the first generation man who moved to Europe and then moved back, returnee. And of those who stayed in Turkey, his children, G2, 77% of his children stayed also in Turkey. 90% of his children moved to Europe. And none of them of his children were born in Europe. That's very logical. Of those migrant first generation men, his children, of his children, about 19% stayed in Turkey. And these are his children who were older than 18, they were not allowed to move to Europe because they were all older, they were adults. And 52% moved with their parents, either at the same time or later on, moved to Europe. And 26% were born in Europe. I also have this similar table for the third generation. And for the returnees, you see of those returnees. So let me say, those who the guest worker program was aiming for, like, we recruit those people, they should come here, work in the factories, and if we finish with them, they should go back, like guest workers, right? Like, these are those people, right, who moved back. And of those, mostly, they did not bring their families. Like 57% of their children did not move to Europe. 29% did move to Europe, and almost 7% of their children were born in Europe. They might have stayed in Europe, we don't know. I mean, we can't see here. Okay, I can tell you a lot about this. It's in the book, you can find more. So who moved? So these are the predictors that made those first generation is in the column, second column, and this is the third column. These are the predictors that made the first generation MEV more or less likely to move to Europe. So I won't focus on this much, but what I would like to emphasize here is that those first generation men with higher education were more likely to move to Europe than lower educated men. So, and this is not significant occupational status. Those with lower occupational status were more likely to move to Europe. And the same thing applies to generation two, their children. We can focus later. I mean, here you have other predictors, but I, again, won't focus on that. But I have shown this to you. There is a large literature about migrant selectivity. And you might remember, or some of you might remember, Trump was saying about migrants, those who come are the criminals and bastards, I'm sorry to say. Is it the case for Turkish migration? No, it's not. Those who came to Europe first and second generation, they were higher educated, but considering their higher education compared to those left behind, they had lower status jobs. And in the literature, we call this status inconsistency. Those with status inconsistency moved more often. Okay, so what else did we study with this data? We studied family generations, marriage, fertility, intergenerational solidarity, and socioeconomic status, education, employment, job status, poverty, friendships, and cultural, like soft side of things, gender roles, religiosity, and political preferences. So I should see, oh my gosh, I'm not doing well time-wise. Family processes. So those who are living in Europe have a higher family solidarity than those who stayed in Turkey. That means they are more, they see each other more often, families living in Europe, Turkish origin families. Here we are comparing them, those who live in Turkey, Europe, we are comparing them with those who stayed in Turkey. Okay. So in terms of family solidarity, solidarity is higher among families who stayed in Europe. And solidarity we measured with different indicators, like those who give more often present to each other, have frequent contact, they call each other more often. And in terms of childbearing, those who live in Europe, they stop having children once they have a son. You wouldn't expect that, but that's the outcome. But those who stayed in Turkey, they continue childbearing until they have 3 children, regardless of the gender of the child. Those who move to Europe and who are in Europe, they are less often in arranged marriages. And those who were born in Europe, they are even less in arranged marriages compared to those in Turkey. You see here that they are like becoming similar to the lifestyle and family processes of those in destination countries. These are only a few results. In terms of socioeconomic outcomes, like there are a lot of potential in the data focusing on return migrants, but I must say we did not focus so much on them. But we can say that return migrants are the best in terms of labor market outcomes. They have a house, multiple, actually more than one house. They have a good occupational status compared even those who stayed in Europe. So they did realize their aims. What was the aim of the guest worker program? Go to Europe, earn money, and then come back and invest in Turkey. So it looks like they realized that they are the best of group compared to those who stayed in Europe and those who stayed in Turkey. Those living in Europe, they are struggling to avoid poverty. Some improvement across generations we notice, but still they are worse off compared to non-migrants in Turkey. That means their labor market outcomes, employment rate, and occupational status especially is lower than those who stayed in Turkey. Those living in Europe have higher educational outcomes. Women even have even higher education, but turning that education into job status is not easy for them. And we say that it's very clear that they are suffering from ethnic penalties and discrimination in the labor markets. And if we look to gender attitudes and roles and religiosity, we see that there is an increased tendency among migrants for spouses to jointly decide on their finances. That is one finding of one paper. And another research, focused on gender attitudes. If you see here, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, you see three lines. The darkest line represent those non-migrant lineage in Turkey. And the lightest, I might be saying something wrong here, sorry. Yeah, no, the darkest line is the line on the top is the migrants in Europe, and the lightest is the returnees, and the in-between line, the line on the bottom, is the non-migrants in Turkey. And this is generation 1, generation 2, and generation 3. So that shows that in terms of gender equality attitudes, those migrants, first, second, and third generation, are the most egalitarian people. And then you have those returnees. Although those returnees in the third generation, they are the most conservative. So those conservative, those who returned are the conservative, most conservative group. And the one who stayed in Turkey, they are, rapidly over generations, catching up with those of migrants in Europe, becoming most egalitarian, gender egalitarian group in the third generation. This is the religiosity on the right-hand side, and in that figure on the right-hand side block, you see generation. That is wrong. It should be, the first bar should be G1, generation 1, 2, and 3. Religiosity, that is praying, declines sharply in those who live in Europe, and those living in Turkey, they also decline over generations, but not as sharply as those living in Europe. Okay, I will now focus more in detail on gendered impact of migration. Let me drink my coffee. So what is that? This we published in the European Sociological Review, and this focuses on the likelihood of employment between different migrant groups. As you see here, the bar on the left side, the one 21%, those are non-migrants. The one next to it are internal migrants in Turkey. And the other one is those migrants who moved to Europe. These are all women. And the last bar, the highest bar, is women who were born in Europe. These include second and third generation who were born in Europe. So you see that there is steep increase across the groups. Women who stayed in those regions I showed you, only 21% of them are in paid employment. And those who moved within Turkey, that percentage moves to 33%. And then those women who moved with their parents when they were young, but they moved themselves to Europe, and 42% of them are in employment. You see that is increasing. And those who stayed in or were born in Europe, 63% are in paid employment. So that is they are almost on the same average as the native population in Europe. This is without controlling anything else. And then if we look to their occupational status, you will see the difference. So in terms of employment, women in Europe are substantially and significantly higher in employment, paid employment. But if you look to their occupational status, we use the ISEI, that is International Standard Socioeconomic Index for Occupations. And this is very often used index for labor market status or occupational status. And there has been a lot of research, international research, so it's okay to use it cross-nationally. And here, this ranking goes up to 90. So if you have a rank of 90, you have the highest occupational status. So those non-migrants in Turkey who stayed within the regions, you see their ranking is 41. And those who moved within Turkey, their ranking is 45, even almost 46. As you see this group, those who moved to Europe, is the same group as this group, migrant who moved to Europe. They are higher employed, but their occupational status is lowest, even compared to those women who stayed in the regions. And you should think of those regions are semi-rural regions. And then those who were born in Europe, these women, they try to catch up, but still their occupational status is lower than the other group, like those who stayed in Turkey and who moved within Turkey. If you combine these two, they are the same. Okay, the overall conclusion here, I would say, and you have, as you have seen, Turks and Turkish origin group in Europe face or experience change towards their destination country, lifestyle, labor market, not labor market, lifestyle, family processes, etc. Gender roles, religiosity, it's slight, but it's decreasing. And they benefit, especially women, benefit a lot from the education. They have substantially higher education compared to those in Turkey. However, they struggle to turn their education into socioeconomic benefits in Europe. Exception is women across 3 generations benefit from migration in terms of labor market outcomes. Here, the employment, the likelihood of employment. So I would like to make recommendations for policymakers, if there is any here who could make a change. Like, migrants are trying to adjust as far as they can, but they are facing exclusion, discrimination, ethnic penalties in the labor market, housing. So if you want to make use of their assets, education and manpower, I would suggest you combat discrimination and exclusion by developing quantitative measures, by doing the, I mean, it's not so politically acceptable in these times, but I think the best way to go still is valuing diversity, um, uh, which will help them, migrants. And I wouldn't think that other migrant groups would be more different, or, I mean, no, I mean, in some areas they would be, but we can discuss that. So, what are the next challenges? So in the third generation, across generation, we saw change and improvement in the third generation. But at that time, the third generation, the average age of the third generation in our data is 24. And that was in 2010-11. So they now have grown. They are now in their 40s, and they made their transitions. And now it's very interesting to see what is happening in their lives. I will therefore, in my new research, focus on that third generation. That third generation, or focusing on the third generation or the grandchildren of migrants, is very difficult in the literature. So identifying the grandchildren in survey research is very difficult. You have to ask a lot of questions about where their parents were born and their grandparents, both sides. It's in my research, in the 2000 families research, so we have that very nicely. That's why that allows us to focus on that generation, the third generation, and that will tell us what the long-term impact of migration is on and assimilation, on the assimilation patterns of the grandchildren. And in this one, I will also use the same perspective, comparing the grandchildren who moved to migrants who moved to Europe and who stayed there, to those of first generation men who did not move from Turkey, and his children did not move, and their grandchildren, his grandchildren did not move. So that will give us the simulation perspective again, and then that will also allow us to isolate change. That will mean change after migration, change across generations, and change within the same generation. And in that new research, I am asking, since the welfare state is under pressure about the elderly, like in Western countries, and we know from little research that is there that migrants look after their own parents and grandparents. That's why and there is not much research how those dynamics are taking place within the families. Who is looking after their parents and maybe grandparents, and who is moving to a care home, maybe. It's not often that it happens. In my new research, let me see. Oh, that's I asked, to what extent have the grandchildren of the labor migrant dissimilated from their origins and assimilated into their destination societies? I will again look at socioeconomic change and position of the third generation and look to intergenerational care arrangements. As I said, I will focus on this third generation, who is now, the mean age is to 38 and in 2025, but I'm in the process of collecting the data. We will be, I think, doing the interviews next year. And we aim to collect about 4,700 grandchildren from 10 European countries and Turkey. And then analyze them. And well, if you are interested, please do follow us in the website of the third generation is this one. And the website of the 2000 Families Project is this one. And you can also email me. And I have finished, I think. Thank you very much.